The night was silent, and the faint hum of a streetlight flickered over the quiet road where the young woman walked alone. She didn't notice the car that had slowed behind her, its headlights dimmed just enough to blend into the darkness. Inside, a man with a calm face and a friendly smile watched her carefully, almost tenderly, as if studying something beautiful he didn't yet own. His hand rested on the steering wheel, his expression unreadable. To anyone else, he might have looked like an ordinary young man, clean-cut, polite, even handsome. But behind those eyes was something else, something hollow and cold that not even his most charming grin could hide for long. His name was Ted Bundy, and before the night was over, someone's world would end forever. What made him so terrifying wasn't just what he did, it was how normal he seemed while doing it. Bundy was the kind of man who made people trust him instantly. He had a gentle voice, a confident posture, and a knack for saying exactly what people wanted to hear. Women found him attractive. Men saw him as ambitious and likable. No one could imagine that the same man who offered to help carry groceries or fix a flat tire was also capable of unimaginable cruelty. In the early 1970s, Ted Bundy's life looked promising. He was a law student at the University of Utah, had studied psychology at the University of Washington, and even volunteered at a crisis hotline, helping people in distress. One of his coworkers, Ann Rule, would later write a book about him, a book that tried to make sense of the impossible. She remembered how kind and attentive he was, how he seemed to genuinely care about the callers on the other end of the line. He was one of the best listeners we had, she would recall years later. He was empathetic, intelligent, and always calm. But behind that gentle voice was a growing hunger. It wasn't for success or affection, it was something darker, something that whispered in his mind late at night. He hid it well, even from himself. On the outside, he was Ted, the promising student. On the inside, he was something else entirely, a man consumed by fantasies of control, violence, and death. No one really knows when Ted Bundy's transformation began. Some say it started with his first heartbreak, when his girlfriend, a wealthy and sophisticated woman named Stephanie Brooks, ended their relationship. Ted had worshipped her. She represented everything he wanted: status, beauty, and power. When she left him, something inside him snapped. He wanted her back not out of love, but out of the desire to prove he could have her, to prove he could control what had once controlled him. That need for control would become his obsession, and soon he would find new targets for it. Bundy began watching women, studying them like puzzles. He noticed how they walked, how they smiled, how they trusted him when he played the part of a harmless stranger. He realized that if he could make them feel safe, he could make them do anything. That was the secret: charm first, cruelty second. By 1974, women in the Pacific Northwest began disappearing. It started quietly: a missing college student here, a vanished clerk there. Police found no trace, no bodies, no clues, just vanished lives, empty dorm rooms, broken hearts. The cities of Seattle and Olympia became haunted by whispers of a man who approached women with his arm in a sling or his leg in a cast, asking for help loading something into his car. His voice was soft, polite, his smile disarming. Most people would never think twice about helping a man like him. That was his weapon, the illusion of innocence. On January 4, 1974, Bundy broke into the basement apartment of an 18-year-old University of Washington student named Corinne Sparks. She was asleep in her bed when he attacked her with a metal rod, leaving her barely alive. She would survive, but the brutality of the assault shocked investigators. Whoever had done it wasn't just violent, he was methodical. He had planned it. The attack wasn't about rage or impulse. It was about control. Only a few weeks later, on February 1, another student, Linda Ann Healy, vanished from her basement apartment near campus. Her bed was neatly made, and her pillowcase and bedsheet were missing, along with her. Police found nothing unusual, except for a few drops of blood on the pillow and a nightgown folded neatly under the blanket. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. The disappearances continued. Donna Manson, Susan Rancourt, Roberta Parks, one by one young women vanished, all around the same age, same look, same region. long brown hair parted down the middle. Ted had a type and he hunted with precision. The pattern became clear only after months of fear and confusion. He was a ghost, always one step ahead of the police, always hiding behind that perfect smile. By the summer of 1974, Bundy's confidence grew. He was no longer content with hiding in shadows. He began abducting women in broad daylight. On July 14, at Lake Sammamish State Park near Seattle, thousands of people were enjoying the sun. Among them was Ted, dressed neatly, with a fake cast on his arm, introducing himself as Ted. Witnesses later recalled seeing him approach several women, asking for help loading his sailboat onto his car. Most declined, but 2 said yes. By nightfall, both were gone. Their names were Janice Ott and Denise Naslund. Witnesses described the same charming man, clean-cut, polite, carrying a cast, driving a light-colored Volkswagen Beetle. When police released a composite sketch, it was the first time the name Ted began circulating as a suspect. People who knew Bundy, his classmates, coworkers, even his girlfriend Elizabeth Klopfer, noticed the resemblance. Elizabeth, who had been dating Ted for years, even called the police to report her suspicions. But Bundy seemed so kind, so gentle, that no one could imagine him as a killer. Ted wouldn't hurt a fly, one friend said. But Ted was already slipping deeper into darkness. He had perfected his routine: lure, abduct, kill, and vanish. He knew when to strike, where to hide, and how to leave no trace. His charm was his camouflage, and his victims never saw the monster beneath it. Elizabeth, meanwhile, lived in quiet fear. There were moments when she noticed strange things: women's clothes that weren't hers, plaster of Paris in his apartment, knives hidden in strange places. Sometimes she would wake up at night and find Ted gone, only for him to return before dawn, calm and smiling. She tried to convince herself she was imagining things. She loved him. How could the man who kissed her goodnight be the same one the police were hunting? But deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. Bundy's double life continued for months. By the end of 1974, he had moved to Utah to attend law school, leaving a trail of death behind in Washington. But even in Utah, the disappearances continued. In October, a young woman named Melissa Smith vanished after leaving a pizza parlor. 9 days later, her body was found in the mountains. She had been beaten and strangled. The pattern was unmistakable. Then came Laura Aim, kidnapped on Halloween night. Her body was found on Thanksgiving. The brutality was escalating, the killings more frequent, the control slipping. Ted Bundy was losing himself to his own darkness. But on November 8, 1974, Bundy made a mistake. He approached a woman named Carol Da Ranch at a shopping mall in Murray, Utah, pretending to be a police officer. He told her someone had tried to break into her car and asked her to come to the station with him. She followed him until she noticed something strange. The road wasn't leading to any police station. When she confronted him, he pulled out handcuffs. She fought back, escaped, and ran for her life. Her courage would later help identify him. By early 1975, Bundy's name began surfacing in multiple investigations across several states: Washington, Oregon, Utah, and Colorado. Yet even as suspicions grew, he continued living his life as if nothing had changed. He smiled at parties, aced his classes, and volunteered at the local Republican campaign office. He was, to everyone else, the image of success. But behind closed doors, he was spiraling. The mask he'd worn so effortlessly for years was beginning to crack. When Ted Bundy was finally pulled over by police in August 1975, he smiled. The officer who stopped him, Bob Hayward, had noticed something unusual: a Volkswagen Beetle creeping through a quiet Salt Lake City neighborhood in the early hours of the morning. Inside, the man looked calm, too calm. When Hayward asked what he was doing, Ted answered smoothly, his tone casual, his smile confident. He said he was just out driving, clearing his head. The officer asked to search the car. That's when things began to unravel. Inside the Beetle, police found a ski mask, a crowbar, handcuffs, rope, and trash bags. At first, it looked like a burglar's toolkit, but something about the neatness, The cold precision of it felt wrong. Hayward's instincts told him this wasn't just a petty criminal. This was someone who planned things, someone dangerous. When Bundy was brought in for questioning, he remained polite and composed. He spoke clearly, smiled often, and never once lost control. Even under suspicion, he carried himself like a man who believed he was untouchable. He was released due to lack of evidence, but investigators began digging deeper. Soon, they realized that the name Ted Bundy appeared in connection with several missing women across multiple states. The net was closing in. Carol Da Ranch, the woman who had escaped his fake police abduction, was brought in to view a lineup. She looked carefully at each man, her hands trembling slightly. When she pointed at Bundy, her voice broke. "That's him." It was the beginning of the end, or so everyone thought. Bundy was charged with the attempted kidnapping of Carol Da Ranch, and the trial began in 1976. In court, he was charming, articulate, and composed. He represented himself with the confidence of a man who believed he could outthink everyone in the room. When witnesses described the fear they felt, he looked almost curious, as if he were studying them, not defending himself. The jury didn't buy the act. He was convicted and sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison. But for Ted Bundy, prison wasn't the end. It was just another obstacle to outsmart. While serving his time, police in Colorado built a murder case against him for the death of Karen Campbell, a nurse who had disappeared from a ski lodge in Aspen in 1975. Bundy was extradited to Colorado in 1977 to stand trial. He arrived there confident as ever, even flirting with journalists and chatting with detectives as though he were a guest rather than a suspect. The courtroom became his stage, and he loved every second of it. Then he did the unthinkable. During a preliminary hearing, Bundy was left unshackled so he could access law books at the courthouse. The guards thought nothing of it. After all, he was representing himself. But Bundy was watching them, memorizing their routines, studying every move. When no one was looking, he opened a second-floor window, looked down at the green lawn below, and jumped. He landed hard, twisting his ankle, but he ran anyway through the streets, through the trees, into the mountains. For 6 days he hid, surviving on stolen food and pure adrenaline. The police scoured the area, searching every cabin and forest trail until they finally caught him. When he was brought back to custody, he smiled again, as if the whole thing had been a game. But Bundy wasn't done. Months later, in December 1977, while awaiting trial in the Garfield County Jail, he began planning again. This time, he carved a hole in the ceiling of his cell, slowly loosening the plaster piece by piece. He lost nearly 30 pounds so he could squeeze through the narrow space. On the night of December 30, while most guards were distracted by the holiday festivities, Ted Bundy vanished into the darkness. By the time they realized he was gone, he was already hundreds of miles away. Bundy fled to Florida, traveling under stolen identities, blending into the world like a chameleon. He was thinner, tired, but still dangerously confident. He rented a small apartment under a fake name, Chris Hagen, in Tallahassee. For a few weeks, it seemed like he might disappear completely, start over, fade into anonymity. But he couldn't stop. The hunger was too strong. The monster was awake again. On the night of January 15, 1978, Bundy broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. What happened next would become one of the most horrifying scenes in American crime history. He entered through a back door left unlocked. The house was quiet, filled with sleeping students. Moving silently through the darkness, Bundy carried a piece of firewood he had picked up outside. In minutes, he turned that piece of wood into a weapon of destruction. He attacked 4 women in their beds, killing 2, Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, and severely injuring 2 others. His brutality was beyond comprehension. He left behind chaos, blood, and terror, then slipped back into the night as if nothing had happened. The survivors' accounts were chilling. One of them, Kathy Kleiner, later recalled waking to a shadow in her room, a man standing over her wielding something in his hand. She never saw his face clearly, but she saw his eyes. Cold, empty. When a roommate's headlights suddenly flashed through the window, Bundy froze, then fled. That flicker of light may have saved her life. Only a few weeks later, Bundy attacked again, this time abducting and murdering 12-year-old Kimberly Leach from her school in Lake City, Florida. It was his final known murder, and it marked the full collapse of his humanity. Whatever charm or control he once had was gone. He was now a predator moving purely on instinct, leaving behind devastation. But his arrogance finally caught up to him. On February 15, 1978, Bundy was stopped by a Pensacola police officer named David Lee. The officer noticed a car with stolen plates and pulled it over. When he approached, Bundy fought back, lunging at him. After a violent struggle, Lee managed to handcuff him. When the officer asked his name, the man hesitated, then sighed. "I guess you got me," he said quietly. "I'm Ted Bundy." The news spread like wildfire. The charming law student, the political volunteer, the man with the perfect smile, was a murderer. The country was stunned. Reporters swarmed the courthouse, crowds gathered outside, and Bundy, instead of hiding from the attention, basked in it. He grinned for cameras, flirted with journalists, and acted as his own attorney once again. It wasn't a trial, it was a performance, and Ted Bundy was the star. The Florida trial was the first to be fully televised nationwide. Millions watched as Bundy cross-examined witnesses, objected with confidence, and smiled at the jury as though he were still the most charming man in the room. But beneath that charm was something hollow, a man fighting not for his life, but for his ego. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Bite marks on one victim matched his teeth perfectly. Witnesses placed him near the scene. His Volkswagen contained hair fibers from several victims. The facade was crumbling, and even Bundy knew it. Yet in court he still managed to manipulate. During his trial for the murder of Kimberly Leach, Bundy did something that stunned everyone. He proposed to his former girlfriend, Carol Ann Boone, in the middle of the proceedings. She accepted. In Florida law at the time, such a proposal in court constituted a legal marriage. Bundy had turned a murder trial into a wedding ceremony. Cameras flashed. The world watched in disbelief. But love couldn't save him. The jury deliberated for less than 7 hours before returning with a guilty verdict. When the sentence was read, the judge, Edward Cowart, looked at Bundy and said something that would echo through time. "You're a bright young man, Ted. You'd have made a good lawyer. I would have loved to have you practice in front of me. But you went another way, partner. Take care of yourself." The sentence was death. Even then, Bundy refused to accept the end. He filed appeals, gave interviews, and continued to manipulate everyone around him. He charmed journalists, played with investigators, and even hinted at new crimes in exchange for more time. Every word he spoke was calculated, every confession designed to keep the spotlight on him. But as the years passed, the mask began to slip. The charming law student was gone, replaced by a hollow man in a prison jumpsuit, his eyes dark and distant. Reporters who met him in his final years described him as strangely detached, calm one moment, pleading the next. He still tried to control the narrative, but the world had finally stopped believing him. The truth was simple and horrifying. Ted Bundy had murdered at least 30 young women, possibly many more. He had fooled friends, lovers, police, and even himself. The man who once spoke sweetly to suicidal strangers on a crisis hotline had become the very monster he once claimed to understand. The final years of Ted Bundy's life were spent in a small concrete cell at Florida State Prison, a place where the noise of the outside world faded, and the silence of his own thoughts began to echo back at him. It was there, in the cold hum of the fluorescent lights, that the once confident, charming man began to unravel. Gone was the crisp suit, the smile that melted suspicion, the smooth words that once twisted reality. What remained was a gaunt shadow of himself, tired eyes, hollow cheeks, and the slow, creeping realization that the mask he'd worn for years could no longer save him. Outside his cell, the world couldn't look away. Reporters lined the prison gates, True crime authors fought for interviews, and psychologists debated endlessly about what made Ted Bundy who he was. Some said he was pure evil. Others said he was the perfect storm of narcissism and trauma. But Bundy himself refused to give them the satisfaction of answers. He thrived on control, even when chained to the floor. Every confession he offered came with a price: attention, time, relevance. He was a master manipulator until the very end. In 1980, Bundy's final appeal was denied. He was officially sentenced to die in the electric chair, Old Sparky, as it was known in Florida. Still, Bundy fought back, filing motions, speaking to lawyers, granting interviews, twisting the system that had once been his playground. He was no longer the predator hiding in plain sight. He was the predator trapped in a cage, and yet somehow he still managed to make people feel his presence. Among those still drawn to him was Carol Ann Boone, the woman he had married in court during his trial. She visited him regularly, convinced of his innocence, speaking of him with tenderness that baffled the world. In her eyes, Ted was misunderstood, a victim of circumstance, a man falsely accused. But time and truth have a way of eroding even the deepest delusions. As Bundy's execution date drew near and his appeals failed one by one, cracks began to form in her faith. He grew distant, colder, unpredictable. He lied even when there was nothing left to gain. By 1986, Carol stopped visiting. She divorced him quietly, taking their daughter with her. The isolation that followed began to gnaw at Bundy. For the first time, there were no more cameras, no crowds, no women mesmerized by his charm. He was just another condemned man waiting to die. But Ted Bundy was never the kind to fade quietly into the background. He still wanted to be the center of attention. He still wanted control. So he began to talk. In 1987, investigators from multiple states began visiting Bundy, hoping he would finally reveal the truth about his victims. For years, families had lived in agony, not knowing where their daughters' bodies were buried. Bundy saw an opportunity. He began dropping clues, admitting to crimes he had long denied but always on his terms. He spoke of the entity, a dark force within him, as if to separate himself from his crimes. He talked about possessions, compulsions, and moments of blackout. But his tone was calculated, his eyes sharp. He wasn't confessing for forgiveness. He was performing once again, turning horror into theater. Bundy's confessions came in fragments, like broken glass reflecting pieces of the truth. He admitted to decapitating some of his victims, to revisiting their remains long after the murders. He described how he would park along highways, waiting for the right moment. The right victim, always someone who seemed kind, trusting, vulnerable. He said he could sense fear like an animal scent in the air. He thrived on it. One detective later said, "Talking to Ted was like staring into a bottomless pit. The more you tried to understand him, the darker it got." Still, Bundy refused to name all his victims. He teased the investigators, hinting at hidden graves in Oregon, Utah, Idaho, places where nobody will ever find them. It was his final act of control. Even on death row, he wanted power over life and death, truth and silence. As the years passed, Bundy became a paradox of celebrity and infamy. College students wrote to him. Psychologists studied him. Television producers begged for interviews. He remained a media fascination, the killer who looked like the boy next door. But those who met him in person said his charm had curdled. His once bright eyes were flat now, his smile mechanical. The emptiness inside him had swallowed everything else. In the late 1980s, his execution date was set again, and this time it was real. January 24, 1989. The world waited. In his final days, Bundy granted a series of interviews, perhaps hopping for one last performance. One of the most infamous was with Dr. James Dobson, an evangelical psychologist. Bundy, who had long avoided talking about motive, now blamed his crimes on pornography. He claimed that violent sexual imagery had unleashed a compulsion within him, that it had twisted his mind from a young age. Many saw this as another manipulation, a desperate attempt to shift responsibility away from himself. Yet, his words rippled across America, sparking a nationwide debate about morality, addiction, and evil. Dobson later said that Bundy's eyes were empty, almost dead, as he spoke. There was no remorse, only calculation, even in his last attempt at redemption. Outside the prison, hundreds of people gathered as the execution hour approached. Some held candles and prayed for his soul. Others chanted, drank beer, and shouted for justice. One sign read, "Burn Bundy, burn." Another, "Toast Ted." It was chaos, grief and anger, fascination and disgust, all mixed into one feverish crowd. Inside, Bundy spent his final night packing his cell. He declined his last meal, accepting only a cup of black coffee. His lawyer said he was calm but distant, as though already somewhere else. When asked if he wanted to make a final statement to the families of his victims, he hesitated, then whispered, "I'd like to express my love to my family and friends." Nothing more. No apology. No remorse. At 7:06 a.m. on January 24, 1989, Theodore Robert Bundy was strapped into the electric chair. His hair was thinner now, his face pale, his once handsome features drawn by years of isolation. Witnesses gathered behind the glass wall, silent, waiting. A leather mask was placed over his face. The room fell quiet. The warden gave the signal. A surge of electricity shot through Bundy's body. His hands clenched, his head jerked back, and within moments it was over. At 7:16 a.m., Ted Bundy was pronounced dead. Outside, when the news broke, the crowd erupted. Cheers filled the air. People waved signs, sang, and danced as smoke rose from the prison chimney. It was a scene of collective release, years of fear, anger, and sorrow erupting in one moment of relief. But for many families, it wasn't closure. It was just silence. Because even in death, Bundy had taken something with him, the truth. He never revealed all the names, never disclosed all the burial sites. Somewhere in the quiet forests and mountain roads of the Pacific Northwest, the remains of his unknown victims still lay hidden, their stories untold. In the years that followed, Bundy became more than just a name, he became a symbol of how evil can wear a charming face, how danger can smile and hold your hand. He wasn't the monster in the shadows, he was the monster standing in daylight, shaking your hand, asking how your day was. That's what made him terrifying. Psychologists continued to study him long after his death. Some labeled him a textbook psychopath, a man incapable of empathy or guilt. Others argued he was something worse, someone who understood morality perfectly but chose to destroy it anyway. He knew what right and wrong were, he just didn't care. Those who had known him before the murders, classmates, friends, coworkers, struggled to reconcile the two versions of Ted. The one who smiled kindly, who carried groceries for old women, who volunteered on a suicide hotline, and the one who killed young women and revisited their corpses in the woods. They were the same man, that was the horror of it. Evil wasn't a monster from a nightmare. It was human, intelligent, polite. It wore a suit and said please and thank you. Ann Rule, the writer who had once worked beside Bundy at the hotline, said in an interview years later, "It's impossible to understand. I remember him as someone who genuinely cared about people, but that's what made him so dangerous. He could make you believe anything." For the victims' families, Bundy's death didn't erase the pain. Many had spent over a decade trapped in grief, waiting for justice that never felt enough. Some mothers kept their daughters' rooms untouched. Some fathers stopped speaking altogether. The ripple of his crimes stretched across generations. Yet in a strange way, Bundy's execution also marked a turning point in America's understanding of evil. His case led to new studies in criminal psychology, new terms like serial killer becoming part of public consciousness. Before Bundy, the concept barely existed in mainstream culture. After him, the world would never see charm and normalcy the same way again. Over the decades, countless documentaries, books, and films tried to capture his story, to dissect what made him, to search for the missing pieces of his soul. But the truth is, there were none. Bundy was a mirror reflecting our worst fears, that monsters don't always hide in darkness. Sometimes they look like us. He fooled the world with his smile, his intelligence, his soft-spoken words. He walked among people, studied them, mirrored their emotions until they trusted him completely. Then he destroyed them. And he did it not out of rage, but out of curiosity, to see if he could, to feel powerful, to remind himself that he controlled the story. Even at the end, Ted Bundy believed he was smarter than everyone else. But in the end, he was just another man, fragile, mortal, stripped of his power by the same world he had tried to manipulate. After his death, his brain was removed and sent for study at the University of Florida. Researchers hoped to find something, a tumor, a lesion, anything that might explain his cruelty. They found nothing. No physical abnormality, no sign of damage. His brain was perfectly normal. The darkness had never been in his flesh. It had been in his choices. Decades later, people still speak his name with a strange mix of fascination and fear. His story has become a warning not just about killers, but about how easily we trust, how easily we are deceived by charm. Ted Bundy was proof that evil doesn't announce itself. It smiles, it shakes your hand, it tells you it loves you, and then it kills. In the quiet after the cheers faded that morning in 1989, the world was left with a question that still lingers today. How many more like him are out there, hidden behind beautiful faces, polite voices, and kind smiles? Because Ted Bundy wasn't born in the shadows. He lived in the light. And that's what made him the most frightening monster of them all. Years after his execution, the legend of Ted Bundy refuses to fade. He exists now as a ghost in America's cultural memory, a cautionary tale whispered in classrooms, true crime documentaries, and the endless cycle of fascination with the darkness that lives inside ordinary faces. He has become a symbol not of power but of warning, a reminder that evil doesn't come with horns or claws. It can come dressed in charm, education, and confidence. Survivors still speak of him not to glorify his name, but to give voice to the women he silenced. They tell their stories so that his smile loses its power, so that people remember the victims, the bright, hopeful young women whose names deserve to be spoken louder than his. Because in the end, Ted Bundy's greatest punishment was not death. It was being unmasked. The world saw through him, saw that behind every grin, every soft-spoken word, there was nothing human left, just a void that consumed everything it touched. And though his body turned to ash that morning in Florida, his story endures, a chilling reminder that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who look just like us.